There is a moment in every soldier's life when training stops speaking and instinct takes over, when the textbook answer becomes the thing that will kill you. On a ridge in Okinawa, one man found himself holding ordnance designed to be fired from steel tubes at safe distances, ordnance that screamed warnings against any contact with its fuse mechanism, ordnance that could vaporize him if he made one wrong move. He had no launcher. He had no time. And the enemy was already inside the room. The tomb smelled like centuries of silence being violated. Technical Sergeant Buford T. Anderson could taste the limestone dust in his throat, thick and chalky, mixing with the cordite residue that hung in the damp April air like fog that refused to lift. Outside, Kakazu Ridge burned under a sky the color of old bruises, and the sound of the Japanese counterattack rolled across the coral and volcanic rock like thunder that never quite finished rumbling. It was April 13, 1945, and Anderson had been on Okinawa long enough to know that the island didn't give anything back. Not ground, not time, not men. The tomb was one of hundreds that dotted the Okinawan landscape, ancient burial chambers carved into limestone hillsides by families who believed their dead should rest within the earth's embrace. The entrance was low, forcing a man to duck, and the interior opened into a chamber perhaps 12 feet across, the walls smoothed by generations of careful hands, now blackened by smoke and pocked with fresh chips where bullets had found stone instead of flesh. Anderson's mortar squad had taken shelter here 3 hours ago when the artillery barrage began, American shells falling on suspected Japanese positions further up the ridge, and they had waited in the darkness while the earth shook and dust rained from the ceiling in sheets that caught the thin light filtering through the entrance. There were 6 of them in the tomb. Anderson could hear them breathing in the darkness, each man processing fear in his own way. Private Kowalski kept clearing his throat, a soft repetitive sound that meant his mouth had gone dry. Corporal Hayes was perfectly still, which meant he was running through equipment checks in his mind, counting rounds and grenades by memory because checking them by hand would waste time they might not have. The others were shapes in the gloom, helmets and rifles and the angular silhouettes of men trying to make themselves smaller than the space required. Anderson's position was nearest the entrance, which meant he would see them first when they came. He had known they would come. The Japanese didn't retreat from Kakazu Ridge, they died on it or they counterattacked, and the intensity of the American barrage meant there would be survivors angry enough and organized enough to come back hard. The Japanese 272nd Independent Infantry Battalion had been holding this section of the ridge for 2 weeks, and they had turned every tomb, every cave, every fold in the coral into a fighting position that had to be burned out or buried. The ridge itself was barely 200 feet high, but it commanded the approach to the interior of the island, and losing it meant losing the anchorage at Naha, losing the airfields, losing everything the invasion needed to succeed. The American barrage stopped at 14:30 hours, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Anderson felt it in his chest, that sudden absence of sound that meant either everyone was dead or everyone was about to move. He checked his M1 Garand by feel, running his thumb over the N-block clip to confirm 8 rounds, checking that the safety was off because there would be no time for safeties when it started. The rifle felt heavier than it should, or maybe his arms were just tired. 3 days on the line without real sleep did things to a man's strength, made him feel like he was moving underwater, every action requiring deliberate thought instead of flowing naturally. They came at 14:40. Anderson saw the first one as a shadow crossing the light at the entrance, low and fast, and his rifle was already coming up when the grenade bounced into the tomb. It hit the floor with a metallic sound that was almost polite, a small object announcing its presence before it ended 6 lives, and Anderson's body moved before his mind caught up. He was diving toward it, hand outstretched, and he caught it on the second bounce, his palm closing around the Type 97 hand grenade with its rough surface and its mechanical fuse that was already counting down. He had perhaps 2 seconds, maybe 3 if the fuse was old or damp. He twisted his body and threw in the same motion, a sidearm snap that sent the grenade back through the entrance, and he was already rolling away when it detonated outside, the blast funneling into the tomb entrance with a pressure wave that felt like being slapped by something solid. His ears rang. The world became muffled and strange. But he could see the Japanese soldier at the entrance, silhouetted against the gray daylight, and Anderson's rifle barked once and the silhouette dropped. Another shape appeared immediately behind the first, and Anderson fired again, the M1's action cycling with mechanical precision, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering the next round in a movement so smooth it felt like breathing. The second soldier went down, but there were more behind him, shadows moving in the smoke and dust, and Anderson fired until the M1's N-block clip ejected with its distinctive ping, the sound that told everyone within earshot that his rifle was empty. He rolled to his right, away from the entrance, and his hands found a fresh clip in his bandolier, and he was reloading even as bullets cracked against the limestone walls, throwing chips of stone that stung his face like insects. 8 more rounds. He brought the rifle up and fired at a shape that appeared at the entrance, fired twice because 1 round was theory and 2 rounds was doctrine, and the shape fell backward. The others in the tomb were firing now, muzzle flashes in the darkness, the sound enormous in the confined space, and the air filled with smoke so thick that Anderson could barely see the entrance anymore. His M1 clicked empty again. He reloaded, hands moving automatically, and he realized with a clarity that felt like cold water that he was down to his last 2 clips. 16 rounds. The Japanese were still coming. He could hear them shouting to each other outside, coordinating, and 16 rounds would not be enough. Nothing would be enough if they rushed the entrance all at once, if they accepted the casualties and pushed through with numbers and momentum. Anderson fired his last 16 rounds in deliberate pairs, making each shot count, aiming for the entrance and the approaches, forcing the Japanese to keep their heads down, buying seconds that might add up to minutes. The last round left the chamber and the N-block ejected, and his hands went to his bandolier and found nothing. Empty. He dropped the M1 and pulled his M1911 pistol, 7 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, and even as he did it he knew that 8 pistol rounds against an organized assault was the mathematical equivalent of surrender. The others were still firing, but their rate of fire was slowing, the inevitable calculus of ammunition expenditure catching up with all of them. Kowalski's rifle went silent. Then Hayes's. The Japanese knew it too. Anderson could hear it in their voices outside, the tone changing from caution to aggression, and he knew they would rush the entrance within the next 30 seconds, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. His hand touched something in the darkness. Wood. A crate. His fingers traced the stenciled letters by feel, and his heart kicked hard in his chest because the letters spelled out what his mind was already screaming could not possibly be real. Mortar shells. 60 millimeter. High explosive. A full crate, perhaps 20 rounds, abandoned here or cached here or left behind by some supply sergeant who never imagined they would be needed in a tomb. Anderson stared at the crate in the dimness, and his mind went to a place that was very quiet and very clear. Mortar shells were not grenades. They were longer, heavier, designed to be dropped down a tube where the firing pin at the bottom would strike the primer and ignite the propellant charge that would send the shell arcing upward and outward to land hundreds of yards away. They had fuses, yes, but those fuses were not designed to arm until the shell experienced the acceleration of launch, the sudden violent force that told the fuse it was time to become dangerous. Throwing a mortar shell by hand would not arm it. Throwing it would just make it a blunt object, an expensive rock. Unless Anderson pulled one of the shells from the crate and held it in both hands. The shell was cold and heavy, perhaps 3 pounds, the body scored with the diamond pattern that aided fragmentation. The fuse was at the nose, a small mechanical device that was, according to every safety briefing he had ever received, completely safe until launch. But Anderson had heard stories, rumors, men in the Pacific talking in low voices about desperate moments when Ordnance had behaved in ways that contradicted the manuals, when desperation had forced innovation that the engineers back home would never approve. The fuse needed impact and rotation to arm. Launch provided both. But what if you could provide the impact another way? What if you struck the fuse hard enough against something solid, something like limestone? Would the internal mechanisms recognize it as launch? Would the arming vane spin free? Would the firing pin align with the detonator? Anderson looked at the limestone wall. Then he looked at the entrance, where shadows were gathering, where voices were coordinating for the final rush. He had perhaps 10 seconds to decide whether to die holding doctrine or to test a theory that would either kill him instantly or give his squad a chance. He stood. His legs were shaking, but they held. He took the mortar shell and he drew his arm back and he struck the fuse against the limestone wall with every ounce of strength he possessed. The impact sent a shock up his arm that made his elbow go numb. The shell's fuse mechanism clicked, A small mechanical sound, and Anderson had no way of knowing if that click meant armed or broken or nothing at all. He stepped to the entrance and he threw the shell. His throwing motion was awkward, the shell heavier and more ungainly than any grenade, his arm having to compensate for the weight distribution, and the shell tumbled end over end through the air and hit the ground perhaps 20 feet from the tomb entrance where Japanese soldiers were gathered in the coral outcropping. For half a second, nothing happened, and Anderson's mind supplied the word dud with perfect clarity. Then the shell detonated. The blast was not like a grenade. It was bigger, louder, the shock wave visible as a sphere of displaced air that threw dust and smoke outward in a perfect expanding ring. The fragmentation was devastating, the scored body of the shell disintegrating into hundreds of jagged pieces that scythed through everything in a 27-meter radius. Anderson saw shapes lifted and thrown, saw the coral outcropping suddenly empty of living men, and the sound of the explosion rolled across the ridge like a statement that could not be argued with. His ears went completely dead. The world became pantomime, silent and strange. But he could see that the entrance was clear, at least for the moment, and his hands were already reaching for another shell. The second shell he armed the same way, striking the fuse against the limestone with a full-body motion that made his shoulder scream. The click came again, that small mechanical acknowledgement, and he threw before his mind could supply reasons why this was impossible. The shell tumbled through the air and detonated further out, perhaps 40 feet from the tomb, where another group of Japanese soldiers had been moving to flank their position. The blast caught them in the open and they went down like grass under a scythe. Anderson's world narrowed to a cycle that was perfectly simple and perfectly insane. Reach into the crate. Pull a shell. Strike the fuse against limestone. Throw. Watch for the blast. Reach for the next shell. His mind stopped questioning whether this should work and accepted that it was working, that each shell he armed against the wall became 3 pounds of high explosive that he could deliver by hand to any point he could throw it. The Japanese assault had lost its momentum. Anderson could see figures falling back, taking cover, trying to understand what was happening. They had expected to overrun a tomb full of Americans with empty rifles. They had not expected artillery delivered by hand, shells falling among them with no warning, no arc of flight to track, no time to take cover. He threw the 5th shell. The 6th. His arm was burning, the muscles screaming, but he kept throwing. The 7th shell detonated near a machine gun position that had been raking the American line further down the ridge, and the gun went silent in a spray of coral and body parts. The 8th shell landed among a group trying to set up a mortar of their own, and their mortar tube went flying, tumbling end over end through the air like a broken toy. Somewhere around the 10th shell, Anderson felt something punch him in the right thigh. Not a bullet, the impact was wrong, too diffuse, and when he looked down he saw blood spreading across his trousers in a dark stain that was growing too fast. Shrapnel. A piece of one of his own shells had found him, a fragment of steel that had traveled 20 meters and still had enough energy to punch through fabric and skin and muscle. The wound burned like someone had pressed a lit cigarette against his leg. Then it went numb. Then it started burning again, worse than before. He reached for another shell. His right leg buckled slightly when he put weight on it, so he adjusted his stance, favoring the left, and he struck the shell against the wall and threw. The blast felt distant now, like something happening to someone else, and he realized his hearing was not coming back, might never come completely back, the continuous exposure to explosions having done something permanent to the delicate mechanisms of his inner ear. The 12th shell. The 13th. His vision was starting to narrow at the edges, a dark tunnel forming, and he knew that meant blood loss or shock or both. His hands were shaking when he reached for the 14th shell, and when he struck it against the wall he almost dropped it, his fingers suddenly clumsy and weak. He threw it anyway, a poor throw that tumbled badly and landed short, but it detonated and that was enough. The 15th shell felt impossibly heavy. Anderson's right leg was dragging now, the muscle not responding properly, and when he looked down he saw his boot was full of blood, the leather dark and wet, and he thought with perfect clarity that he was probably going to die in this tomb after all, just slower than he would have if the Japanese had rushed the entrance 3 minutes ago. He armed the 15th shell and threw it toward a group of Japanese soldiers who were trying to regroup behind a coral formation, and the shell landed among them and turned their cover into their grave. Anderson counted perhaps 4, maybe 5 bodies visible after the blast cleared, but there were certainly others he could not see. The 16th shell was the last one he could lift. His arms had gone beyond pain into a kind of distant numbness where they still moved but felt like they belonged to someone else. He struck the fuse and the impact sent him staggering, his right leg giving out completely, and he threw from a kneeling position, the shell tumbling awkwardly through the air. It landed at the base of the ridge, among the last organized group of Japanese soldiers he could see, and when it detonated the group ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Anderson tried to stand and could not. His leg had stopped working. He sat down hard, his back against the limestone wall, and he looked at the entrance and saw that it was clear. The Japanese counterattack had stopped. Bodies lay scattered across the coral and volcanic rock, some moving weakly, most still, and the few who could still walk or crawl were pulling back, retreating toward their own lines, the momentum of their assault broken by a man with a crate of ordnance and a theory about fuses. The others in the tomb were talking to him, but he could not hear them. Their mouths moved, but no sound reached him through the ringing silence that filled his head. Hayes was wrapping his thigh with a tourniquet, pulling it tight, and the pain of that cut through the numbness and made Anderson's vision go white for a moment. When it cleared, he saw Kowalski at the entrance, rifle up, covering the approach, and Anderson wanted to tell him he could relax, that the Japanese were done for now, but his mouth would not form words. Time became unreliable. Anderson thought perhaps 10 minutes passed, or maybe 30, and then he heard through the ringing a sound that was beautiful and terrible, the whistle of American artillery coming in, fire missions called in by observers who had watched his one-man mortar barrage and coordinated their own shells to finish what he had started. The ridge erupted in fountains of earth and smoke, methodical and thorough, walking up and down the Japanese positions with the kind of overwhelming firepower that made infantry assaults obsolete. Someone was carrying him. Anderson realized he was outside the tomb, being moved down the ridge toward the aid station, and the daylight hurt his eyes after the darkness of the tomb. He tried to tell them he could walk, but his mouth still would not work properly. The morphine they had given him was making everything soft and distant, and he thought that was probably for the best because the wound in his leg was starting to announce itself as something serious, something that might cost him the leg if the aid station surgeon was having a bad day. The aid station was a tent behind the ridge, and inside it smelled like ether and blood and disinfectant, a combination that should have been nauseating but instead felt almost comforting because it meant doctors and treatment and the possibility of survival. The surgeon who examined Anderson's leg was a captain with hands that moved quickly and precisely, probing the wound, checking for arterial damage. Anderson watched his face and saw the moment when the captain found something that worried him. A flicker of concern that was quickly masked but not quickly enough. The shrapnel had missed his femoral artery by perhaps a centimeter. The captain told him this later, after the surgery, when Anderson was lying on a cot with his leg wrapped in bandages that were already showing spots of seepage. A centimeter. The width of a finger. The difference between a wound that would heal and a wound that would have bled him out in the tomb before anyone could apply a tourniquet properly. Anderson spent 3 days in the field hospital before they evacuated him to a hospital ship, and during those 3 days he learned what his impromptu mortar barrage had accomplished. Approximately 25 Japanese soldiers killed directly by the shells he had thrown. The counterattack stalled and broken, the momentum lost, the survivors falling back to positions where American artillery could reach them properly. His squad intact, all 6 men alive because he had bought them the minutes they needed for help to arrive. The other thing he learned was that what he had done was impossible. An ordnance officer visited him on the second day, a lieutenant who looked like he had not slept in a week, and the lieutenant explained in careful terms that arming a mortar shell by striking it against limestone should not work. The fuses were designed to require the sustained acceleration of launch, not a single impact. The arming vane needed the rotation imparted by the barrel's rifling, not the tumbling motion of a thrown object. By every engineering standard, what Anderson had done should have resulted in either dud shells that failed to detonate or, more likely, shells that detonated prematurely and killed him instantly. But 25 Japanese soldiers were dead and Anderson's squad was alive, so clearly something about the lieutenant's engineering standards had failed to account for desperation and limestone walls and the particular type of recklessness that came from having no other options. The lieutenant made Anderson promise not to tell anyone how he had armed the shells, because if word got out that this technique worked even once, some other desperate soldier might try it and might die when their shells detonated immediately, and the army could not be seen as endorsing a tactic that violated every safety protocol in the manual. Anderson promised, though he knew the promise was meaningless because the other men in the tomb had seen what he did, and soldiers talked, and within a week the story would spread through the entire division regardless of what any lieutenant wanted. But he understood why the lieutenant had to ask, had to try to contain something that could not be contained, because the alternative was acknowledging that sometimes the impossible worked, and that acknowledgement would undermine the entire structure of rules and regulations that kept an army functional. The Medal of Honor citation came through 6 weeks later, while Anderson was still recovering in a hospital in Hawaii. The language was careful and formal, describing his actions in terms that were heroic but vague about the specific mechanics of what he had done. The citation mentioned his courage and his initiative and his disregard for personal safety, all of which were true, but it did not mention limestone walls or fuse mechanisms or the clicking sound that meant armed or broken or nothing at all. The citation was a story that could be told in official channels, and the real story was something that would live in the unofficial histories, the one soldiers told each other in quiet moments when the officers were not listening. Anderson received the medal in a ceremony that felt surreal, standing in a dress uniform that fit poorly because he had lost weight during his recovery, accepting a piece of ribbon and medal from a general whose name he immediately forgot. The cameras clicked and the reporters asked questions about how it felt to be a hero, and Anderson answered in monosyllables because he did not know how to explain that it had not felt like heroism. It had felt like mathematics and panic and the certainty that doing nothing meant dying. After the war, Anderson went home to a small town in Louisiana where no one asked him questions about Okinawa and he could work in silence. He took a job as a mechanic, fixing cars and trucks, and the precision of engine work felt comfortable after the improvisation of combat. People knew he had received the medal because the newspaper had run a story, but Southern courtesy meant they did not press him for details, and he was grateful for that courtesy more than he was grateful for the medal itself. He married a woman named Dorothy who had known him before the war and did not treat him differently after it. They had 3 children and Anderson taught them to throw baseballs with proper form, a full-body motion that generated power from the legs and hips and shoulders, and he never told them that the muscle memory came from throwing objects far heavier and more dangerous than baseballs. When his children asked about the war, he told them he had done his job and come home, and that was true enough to satisfy them until they were old enough to understand that some truths were too complicated to fit into simple stories. The nightmares came irregularly, months or years apart, and they were always the same. He was back in the tomb and the shells would not detonate. They landed among the Japanese soldiers and sat there like broken promises, and the soldiers kept coming and his hands kept reaching for shells that had become useless. He would wake from these dreams with his heart hammering and his hands shaking, and Dorothy would hold him until the shaking stopped, and she never asked what he had dreamed because she understood that asking would not help. In 1968, a military historian writing a book about Okinawa contacted Anderson and asked if he would consent to an interview about April 13, 1945. Anderson declined politely. The historian sent letters for 3 years, each one more insistent, explaining the historical importance of Anderson's actions, the uniqueness of his improvisation, the need to document the event before the participants died and the knowledge was lost. Anderson burned the letters unopened after the first 3. The knowledge did not need to be documented. The knowledge needed to be forgotten or at least allowed to fade into the kind of story that soldiers told each other without verification, a tale that might be true or might be embellished or might be completely fabricated, and the uncertainty was fine because the uncertainty meant no one would try to replicate it. Anderson died in 1998 quietly of heart failure, in the same house where he had raised his children. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned the Medal of Honor in the 3rd paragraph, after his service as a deacon at First Baptist and his 40 years at Morrison's Auto Repair. The funeral was small and the people who attended were mostly local, men and women who had known him as a neighbor and a mechanic and a man who could fix anything that had an engine. One old man in a uniform attended, someone Anderson had served with, and he stood at the graveside after the others had left and he saluted the casket with a precision that suggested long practice. The tomb on Kakazu Ridge still exists, though the entrance has partially collapsed and the interior has been sealed by the Japanese government as a historical site. Tourists sometimes visit the ridge, mostly Japanese, and they leave flowers at the markers that commemorate the soldiers who died there. No marker mentions Anderson or what happened in the tomb, and that would have pleased him, the anonymity, the sense that the ground itself remembered without needing to announce it. The crate of mortar shells was recovered by American forces 3 days after the counterattack, and a report was filed noting the unusual depletion of ammunition with no corresponding mortar tube in the vicinity. The report went into a file that went into an archive, and no one read it because the war was ending and there were more important things to document than logistical anomalies. Years later, a graduate student researching ammunition expenditure patterns during the Okinawa campaign found the report and noted it as a clerical error, because the alternative explanation was impossible and therefore not worth investigating. The impossible happened anyway in a tomb on Okinawa with a man who had run out of options and time and ammunition. It happened because desperation is its own kind of engineering, and because sometimes the fuses arm when you strike them against limestone, and because 27 meters is enough range to break a counterattack if you are willing to throw 16 times while bleeding. It happened because one man decided that dying while doing something was preferable to dying while doing nothing, and that calculation, simple as it was, changed the outcome of a battle and saved 5 lives and earned a medal that he never spoke about publicly. History remembers the battles and forgets the moments, the small, desperate improvisations that change everything. Kakazu Ridge is remembered as a costly American victory, and that is accurate, but accuracy misses the texture, the limestone dust and the clicking fuses and the smell of blood mixing with cordite. Those details died with Anderson and the others who were there, and maybe that is appropriate. Maybe some knowledge should be allowed to fade because preserving it would require reliving it, and reliving it would break something essential in the survivors. But on April 13, 1945, in a tomb on Okinawa, Technical Sergeant Buford T. Anderson threw bombs with his bare hands and walked away alive, and that fact exists independent of whether anyone remembers it properly. The limestone remembers. The coral remembers. The ground that drank the blood of 50 men that afternoon remembers, and memory does not require witnesses. It only requires that something happened and left marks that time cannot completely erase. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing to this channel. Stories like Anderson's deserve to be told, and your subscription helps ensure they don't disappear into the archives completely. If this account moved you or taught you something about the nature of combat and improvisation under impossible pressure, please leave a like. And here is the question I want you to consider. Anderson violated every safety protocol, took a risk that could have killed him instantly, and succeeded through a combination of desperation and luck that no engineer would endorse. If you were in that tomb with your ammunition exhausted and the enemy seconds from overrunning your position, could you have done what he did? Could you have struck that first shell against the wall, knowing it might detonate immediately and end you? Or would the fear of dying by your own hand have been stronger than the fear of dying by inaction? Think about that, and then ask yourself what that answer reveals about the distance between ordinary courage and the kind that earns medals no one wants to receive.